this is going to talk more about sexual violence, of course, but we're moving a little bit from sort of perception and labels and moving into like actual incidents of violence against children. So for the residential school system began in 1831 with the intention of killing the Indian in the child by removing Indigenous children from their homes and placing them in boarding schools that were run by the Catholic Church. The residential school system has not only left a forever lasting trauma on Indigenous children, but on Indigenous family structures as a whole. The effects of the residential schools is strongly responsible for the loss of many Indigenous ways of being. The loss of cultural traditions is directly linked to the loss of language. So one of the most interesting facts about the residential school system is that they did not have the funding to put actual educators into these schools. They weren't funded and they weren't properly taken care of. However, the church actually sent over priests, clergymen, and nuns to these schools in order to be the educators, because in their mind, killing the Indian and the child was sort of bringing them to God. If we can create a future for Indigenous people that is religious and they are fearing of God and not of their savage ways, then that is worthy enough to keep their people alive. So you have these priests, these nuns, these clergymen in the church, not in the church, in the schools, because what they're doing is justifiable and it's godly. However, because you believe in God, it does not make you a teacher, does not make you an educator. So oftentimes when they were trying to enforce, say, English to these students, they wouldn't actually go through like any kind of program. They would just say, speak English, speak God's language, you filthy savage. So there isn't really any groundwork for Indigenous children to communicate, to learn, and to actually have an understanding of why this is happening to them. And oftentimes they can't even talk to each other because they would fill these schools with children from different tribes, from different nations, communities. And the difference between Indigenous languages on Turtle Island is like the difference between English and French. Um, if you don't speak French and you're a native English speaker, you might have a rough time. Um, so the breakdown of the family structure happens because of the ways in which children couldn't talk to their parents. So you have children who go off to these schools, and then you have parents who are home waiting for their children to return. And when they do, they don't have a grasp on English and they don't have a grasp on their mother tongue. So that kind of creates this separation of these children from the larger community. If you can't talk to your people, you're going to be ostracized. Um, and they weren't no longer a part of the community like they were before they were taken into these schools. And that, of course, creates long-lasting trauma. It creates a breakdown of the family structure that the Indigenous people had created. Um, and so much ensues thereafter. And one of the things that my elders told me very recently that I never considered is that he asked me, what do you think the parents did after their children were taken? What happened to the parents in these situations? What did they do? And I thought about it for a while, and then he said, they drank. They drank a lot. Um, because you're mourning this relationship, you're mourning your child, you're mourning the fact that like this system is unreasonably separating and destroying your family and destroying the family it did do. So you're gonna drink maybe. Um, and that is also, once again, where the stereotype of Indigenous people being alcoholics kind of bears fruit. Um, you have adult people grieving and drinking, and then you get this sort of stereotype put out there that they are lazy, that they are alcoholics, they are substance misusers. And it didn't turn out well for them at all. Going back to the slide, so we're going to talk about residential schools and sexual violence now, so take care of yourselves. One of the darkest realities of the residential school system is the staggering amount of reports of sexual violence taking place in these institutions. One of the key aspects of the residential school system is how employment was handled. Largely, employees either didn't get paid or they were paid next to nothing. The majority of these educators that were present in schools were nuns and whomever else they could hire. Background checks were rarely enforced. Quite often, children who attended these schools would either experience mental, physical, and/or sexual violence constantly. Due to the rights of the Indigenous child at the time and the culture of secrecy that the church is famous for, abusers were often able to continue abusing without much consequences. Most often, students experience sexual violence from priests, staff members, local communities, and other children. It is one of the most upsetting, I guess, realities of the residential schools is that because of the cycle of abuse and how it exists, um, oftentimes victims would become perpetrators of violence. And it was a thing, and it's a thing that continues to happen that really just sucks because this started from somewhere where they had no control. And then this learned behavior kind of continues and trickles down into generations and generations where oftentimes you have reports on children being abused and hurt and harmed by adults. But when it happens with children to other children, um, the conversation gets really upsetting and people like tend to turn a blind eye. But that is the reality that happened and continues to happen quite often. And what's really upsetting is by the time these kids get older, do they then realize that, oh my God, I did something irreversible. Um, but once again, learned behaviors, it is a cycle that is really difficult to break. Um, and that is what happened to a lot of Indigenous children. Tristan Hopper, who's a journalist, wrote this report saying students were kept constantly hungry and were relentlessly cowed into meek obedience through corporal punishment, both of which would be ruthlessly exploited by abusers. So for people who are abusers and predators, they love having the power in the situation. We all know this. They love being the one with authority. They love being the heavy hammer. They love taking people's autonomy away from them, and they love knowing that they took this away from them. So when you have people who are in positions of power, simply for being there and simply for not being Indigenous, and if they are predators, they are going to do this quite often. They are going to be abusive. So moving on to intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma, sometimes referred to as trans or multi-generational trauma, is defined as trauma that gets passed down from those who directly experience an incident to subsequent generations. Intergenerational trauma may begin with a traumatic event affecting an individual, traumatic events affecting multiple family members, or collective trauma affecting larger community, cultural, racial, ethnic, or other groups, populations. Historical trauma. So there is this statistic that I think says that children of residential school survivors are 2.5 times more likely to experience sexualized violence. And adults who experience sexual violence as children are 10% more times likely to once again have a repeated incident of sexual violence in their adulthood. Um, and the residential school system didn't end until 1996, which is 1 year before I was born. It is so recent that my mother actually went to a residential school. My sister went to day school, which is like a residential school, but the children go home afterwards. Um, so I am the youngest of three. My eldest sister went to day school, but my middle sister and I didn't, which makes us the first members in my entire family's generation, our ancestry, that did not go to a residential school, which means, of course, that I am a part of this statistic. Um, and a lot of children are. It's a very recent trauma that happened not too long ago. And oftentimes, children who attended these schools had to convince themselves that it actually wasn't even that bad. And it wasn't until recently that my mother admitted to my sisters and I that her residential school experience was quite bad. Um, and once again, that's just really a lot. That's really tough. Um, yeah, it is deeply unfortunate, and it's a current cycle that a lot of people in Indigenous reservations and community are trying to break continuously. Um, but it's really hard when you don't have the proper support, and it's really hard when people still think of you as being less than human. Indigenous people have been living with harsh stereotypes for hundreds of years. And these harsh stereotypes have convinced people who are not Indigenous to treat them without any regard or moral considerations, as I've said before. Um, and once you're like growing up in a reservation and on community, you can see the ways that people treat you differently. You can see the ways that people stare at you or give your family dirty looks or follow you around in the grocery store. And so what unfortunately happens is that a lot of Indigenous youth stay on reservation because the community is safer. Um, so you have this perception that Indigenous people are savages, lazy, so on and so forth. Um, and like this is all rooted in a kind of moral compass. Remember earlier when I was talking about how people or Indigenous people were seen as dirty and without wearing any clothes or very little clothes, and this was seen as sinful. Um, but what is really hard is that the Indigenous people themselves didn't see it as sinful, they saw it as practical. It had utility, it had purpose to dress without many layers or with a lot of skin showing. But like this sin was rooted in a moral compass. But what is unfortunate is that oftentimes the moral compass is rooted in whiteness and Christianity. One time I had somebody tell me that I wasn't very humble, and I was like, "Of course not. Why would I need to be humble in any sense? I need people to know that I'm brilliant. I need people to know that I am worth being here and that I have authority in this space because I have done a lot of work." And the person who said that I wasn't humble was quite shocked that they never thought of it this way. And I'm like, yeah, of course. And it's a weird moral standard that exists for reasons I don't understand. Um, but all I'm to say is that the perception that people create about groups of people or others, or even an individual in high school, can ruin their lives. It can create opportunities for people to treat them without regard. So be careful with your words. Remember, words matter, words hurt, words have impacts on people, and they keep them oppressed.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive um, presentation and learning more about the historical component to trauma and sexual violence. And I hope everybody in attendance today will be taking something away from that. And yeah, I was getting a little emotional and uncomfortable too. And I'm kind of glad that I did, because that's how we're we're going to change what the current reality is. If we all stay in our comfort zones and ignore what's going on around us, then nothing will change. So I know this will certainly continue to inspire me as I lead my organization, and so we can better support our communities and to bring much needed awareness to the problem. And so thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and sharing that experience. And we have a question here. When working with youth, do you find they want to learn more about their culture?
Absolutely. I do have one thing to clarify though. I think I said in my residential school section that we lost all of our ways of being. We didn't. They still survived. They're being taught from my elders to me, and I'm going to teach them to the youth that I work with and the Indigenous youth that I work with because they're still strong. And I'm even still learning today. And it kind of ties into the next question. I feel like people and young people are hungry to learn about their own culture and religion, but it is just that the institution of school does not teach them to care about it. I remember when I was in sort of elementary school, I had a choice to take treaty day off from class if I wanted to, and it's a thing that all Indigenous people should do, take it off from class and from work. But it was always seen as an option, and nobody ever told me the reasons why Treaty Day mattered and why it mattered for me to stay home and be with my community. But when I didn't stay home and I went to school, I was actually applauded by the staff and faculty members of the high school or the elementary school for not being like my Indigenous peers. Um, so you have this sort of already instilled idea that rejecting your heritage is going to be quite beneficial for you in a professional setting. And I feel like young people aren't taught to believe that both can exist at the same time, that you can bring your traditions and your culture into your work life and everyday life. And I didn't learn that until I was in my early 20s.
So a question that I have, and I have been asking this of all of the presenters throughout the series, is what can our organizations that are, predominantly white or visibly white, what can we do to let those in your community know that we are a safe place, and you can access programs and services through organizations like ours? What can we do to build that trust that is needed?
I think I think oftentimes these sort of spaces work a lot from like an academic framework. And I think for a lot of people, I could sort of like places that feel hostile also tend to feel academic as well. Places that feel like mostly white coded feel unapproachable because with the community I'm from, at least, a lot of young people and youth in my reserve have been told that they're like dumb or that they're like unworthy of the service in some way. Um, so I think like trying to make any spaces more accessible, being like language and giving them space to be messy and to find their footing and to make mistakes is really beneficial. Especially if young people from like a reserve might say something wrong, for example, might like use the incorrect pronoun, might like use the incorrect whomever, wherever. um, my mother even one time said to me that she has issues joining me and my friends because she doesn't want to make a mistake. So making these low barrier spaces actually low barrier is going to be really helpful. And also it can be really hard to like let people know that you're cool, if that makes any sense. Like, I feel like a lot of Indigenous youth on the reservation I was in, um, really, like, weren't always trusting, um, of folks who were coming in off of reservation. There's always gonna be a little bit, I think, of, like, precaution around people who aren't Indigenous. So I think breaking down these walls and, like, letting people know that you're cool and you're a safe person to be around, and that you're not gonna take anything from them is really beneficial. Um, Also, a lot of Indigenous youth don't get a chance to leave the reserve. So if you're willing and able to go to the reserve and one, know your place and know your place in the community, and know that you're a guest on the land, it's gonna be a much more open, experience.
Thank you for that. And yeah, one of the attendees um, added that doing community outreach and going onto the reserves, be vendors at powwows, come to their safe places to engage and build relationships. And that helps to build those relationships between communities, which is great to see.
Mhm.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us, maybe kind of hesitant about going to the First Nations, and maybe questioning if it's appropriate to do so, or what are your thoughts on just kind of bridging those communities, and how we can create a better network to support each other.
I think it's always really helpful, like, representation matters, and, like, somebody had said, like, once, like, volunteering to join a powwow, to be security, to do work and put in work is going to go a long way. I know, like, a lot of, especially talking to, like, elders or, like, adults in the community, I feel like sometimes the children can be really nervous of outsiders, but the adults just love to have a good belly laugh and cackle, and they love to have fun with you. So have fun. Like once again, know your place is always good. Be willing to have a good laugh. So many Indigenous people I know love to tell a joke. They love to get people laughing. I do too. So be willing to have fun. Um, but representation also does matter. Oftentimes, when I am with my friends who are like people of color, we let down a wall. We let down our guard a little bit because um, we just know that like each other kind of has an understanding of the experience of racism. And having that exist there and knowing that, like, you're in a safe place with somebody goes so far.
Um, but now that we're wrapping up this series, today is the last day. I think we've all learned a lot over these past 4 days, and I think with today too, because especially here in Colchester and in Truro, I think it is important that we reach out to those racialized and marginalized communities, because here in Truro we do have 3 distinct African Nova Scotian communities, and we do have Millbrook and Indian Brook not far away. So Truro is uniquely positioned to be a catalyst for the change that is needed. And I hope this series contributes to that. And it's been a pleasure learning from you and from all of the other presenters these last 4 days, and we hope that the Colchester Sexual Assault Centre is going to be on the forefront of building a stronger community and bridging those gaps, and making sure that all of our communities are better supported. So thank you for for joining us today and sharing that story and that history and your expertise with us. We really appreciate it.